Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And today's installment is called Muscle Memory in Search of Lost Time. Hi everybody. I'd like to start with this short excerpt from Hamlet to explain the major theme of this talk. So this is Act 1, Scene 5, and most people will be familiar with this. So Horatio says to Hamlet, "Oh, day and night, but this is wondrous strange." And Hamlet says, "And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." No, those last two lines most people have heard before, and they're, obviously very famous. But I've added emphasis to the line above. And therefore, as a stranger, give it welcome. And that's in response to the concept, this is wondrous strange. So this is all in the context of they've seen the father, the dead, murdered father of Hamlet. So the supernatural events, but without limiting it to the notion of, supernatural events and ghosts, what I take from this is that Hamlet's saying that there are aspects of reality that are strange, wondrous strange, and as a stranger, give it welcome. In other words, don't limit yourself to a strictly philosophical way of understanding the world. So render unto Caesar what is Caesar. Science needs to be respected. You do not want to go over a bridge that someone like me has designed. But in an era where science dominates and our understanding of the world is transmitted predominantly to us through completely technically accurate photographs and video images, TikTok, Instagram, this, YouTube itself. But we increasingly, because we don't have access or we don't immerse ourselves in great art like previous generations, we have this disproportionately technically correct but arguably less true experience of the wondrous strange. And that's a distinction between the correct and the true that I'll be exploring on another date, but it's Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, makes this distinction. Something can be correct, but it's not necessarily true, and vice versa. So this is the order I'm going to address some of the themes. So for people of a certain generation, you might remember "Pulling Muscles from a Shell" is a lyric from a song, I think it was in the 80s, but it's a band called Squeeze. And I'll be showing you a mussel shell is arguably where this whole thing started, the whole human encounter with art. So I'll show you an image and explain that shortly. And this notion of ekphrasis is a classical notion that's present in Plato's work. And the idea is it's to do with, it's a very many layered and complex notion, but in essence, to simplify it, it's about understanding one art form by means of another. Or another way to think of it would be the mixing of visual art and written texts. So understanding a visual form or discussing a visual form through words. So two different genres, two different mediums. And the whole purpose of this channel, in some ways, is to explore the concept of ekphrasis by bringing in philosophy, by bringing in theatre, poetry, and applying it to visual images. And also introducing people, hopefully, who aren't that familiar with art, but may know a bit of philosophy, may know a bit of literature. And it's, for me, the fascination is in the gaps between the two. Neither visual art nor literary art can fully explain the human condition, and each in their own way have strengths and weaknesses. So throwing as many different perspectives into the mix as possible, I find embellishes each individual art form and helps you to appreciate them in a different way. And I'd argue that is the essence, the basis of ekphrasis. Now, a very practical example of ekphrasis is the shield of Achilles, and it's in Homer's Iliad, and it's book 18, the end of book 18. And the shield of Achilles, the point is, it's Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey were obviously their oral epics. It was word of mouth. They were repeated by skilled storytellers. So the shield of Achilles, as described in the Iliad, never had existence outside an epic poem, outside words. But what Homer does is he describes in detail, much more detail than could possibly go on an actual shield, the very variegated aspects, the aspects of everyday life that are placed on the shield by Hephaestus, I think it is. He's the god, he's the smithy of the gods. And the mother of Achilles, Thetis, asks for the shield to protect her son. And on the shield are these representations of, I'll show you in a second the pattern, but basically on the shield are representations of all human activity. And it's not so much meant to tell a story as just to present agriculture, people getting married, the general life of humanity. And the point is, that type of life is represented on a shield, which is a figment of the imagination of a fictional character in an epic story. So there's layer upon layer upon layer, which arguably that's what art does. It layers our experience of reality. And ekphrasis is part of that. So the shield of Achilles isn't an actual physically existing shield. I'll show you examples of representations that people have imitated, but it was only ever in the mind of Homer. And then I would argue the best of all practical examples of the concept of ekphrasis is Proust and his magnum opus, À la recherche de temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time. And throughout that, riddled throughout that brilliant novel, are many, many references to art. So I'll just give you a few of them to show the way in which, and it was true in real life, Proust was a massive fan of painting and very knowledgeable. And if you read In Search of Lost Time, it's a bit of an effort, I know, but if you read it, it's amazing how the paintings that Proust was familiar with and his narration of a fictional childhood that obviously has semi-autobiographical elements, it's amazing how much of his experience of life intertwined with the fiction of visual art, but in ways that enriched his real life. And the interaction of real life and his appreciation of the art are almost inseparable. And throughout the novel, his experience of reality it's just tangible, it's palpable, the descriptions are so rich in tactile sensation, allied with brilliant descriptions of the role of art in helping us understand our experience as human beings. So, without more ado, I will show you. This is just just a quick example. I'll show you in more detail in a second, but that's a representation of Achilles' shield. But this refers to the muscle of the title. So if you can have a good close look at that. And then I should perhaps let you know that the background to this was, I think it was found originally in 1890 by a physician and it was found in Indonesia. And I think it was a Victorian physician, because fossil hunting was hugely popular. And then it was more recently, I think, at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and there was also some Australian academics involved. They did a lot of research, so they obviously didn't know all this information I'm about to tell you in the 1890s. But now with modern technology, they can. So the information, it's fascinating stuff. So it's estimated to be between 540,000 and 430,000 years old. And it's what you were looking at is a now extinct subspecies of freshwater mussel, Pseudodon vondembuskianus trinilensis. So I'm going to go to bed now. I've managed to pronounce that. A very, very good score at Scrabble, I'm guessing. And it's so old that it was found alongside the bones of not even Homo sapiens, but Homo erectus. So pre what we'd recognise now as the more biologically modern human being. Homo erectus was before Homo sapiens, obviously. And there are some objects that they found that are very, hundreds of thousands of years old that could have been manipulated by humans, but it's debatable. Whereas I'd suggest that this particular object, the patterns are too obviously of prototypical human, at least hands. And also it should be pointed out that at the hinge, of a mussel, when you're trying to open an oyster or a clam or a mussel, there's the ligament at the corner of the shell. On the actual shell where they found, on this shell, there's a little perfect circle where they've obviously learned, this Homo erectus have learned to undo the hinge, because they ate them raw. If you cooked these mussels, they'd open naturally, but Homo erectus ate them raw. So they learned how to open them. So there's a perfect circle, and there's these marks. So I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that these are deliberate patterns. So you can then debate, well, does it count as art? But it's definitely figurative markings from some of the earliest human beings. So I wanted to go into a bit more depth with the concept of ekphrasis. And in English, I'm not sure about North American English, but in proper English, British English, colonial English, a word in your shell-like means a word in your ear, because the ear is shell-like in shape. And that's another example of ekphrasis in a way, because you're mixing words and expressions with an image of a shell. But this is from Plato's Phaedrus. So it's one of the Socratic dialogues. And it's part of when Plato is talking around this theme of ekphrasis. Phaedrus, that it is the strange thing about writing which makes it truly correspond to painting. The painter's products stand before us as though they were alive, but if you question them, they maintain a most majestic silence. It is the same with written words. They seem to talk to you as if they were intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say, from a desire to be instructed, they go on telling you just the same thing forever. So that's Plato discussing it in the dialogue Phaedrus, and he introduces the concept of ekphrasis in relation to the notion of forms, and I think that's Book 10 of the Republic. But I just think it's fascinating that, that early on, approximately 370 or 300, about 370 BC, I think this is roughly. They're in the mid 300 BCs. But then the shell-like shield of Achilles. So what I wanted to do was keeping in mind, if you can keep talking about, vivid mental images, which is partly what ekphrasis is about, the creation of vivid mental images. If you can remember that mussel shell, the very first type of human art that we can probably imagine. And then you have Homer's The Shield of Achilles, which I don't, quite similar in shape, and another very early. So you're talking Homer's Iliad and Odyssey from memory. What is it? The guess 500, 600 BC. So I would argue that's classical times, early version of the mussel shell. This time it's the shell-like shield of Achilles. And just to show you you've seen that's one version of the shield, and this is the type of how the shield is described. It's book 18 of the Iliad, called the Shield of Achilles, and these were the topics, if you can make them out, as Homer describes them. And this is another more colourful version. And remember, because it was a fictional shield in an oral epic, so these are just other artists. This time it's the reverse. So often ekphrasis is about putting into words what images portray. This time it's visual artists trying to portray what was originally put in words. So the direction can go both ways. And this is Franco Ferrucci's interpretation of Achilles' shield. So he says it's round in shape, encircled by representation of the ocean river, which is also the outer boundary of the earth, and with the sun, the moon, and all the constellations depicted in the centre. It is a compendium of the cosmos. So the idea is, for Homer, he encapsulated the Greek cosmological knowledge of how the universe was constructed and represented it on the shield. So the outer rim of the shield was this ocean river, which the Greeks believed was at the outer ends of the known world. And everything was contained within the shield. So the shield is a metaphor within an oral epic. The oral epic is a practicing metaphor of the human condition in artistic form, and that's how you begin to get wheels within wheels. That's how art works. So again, this is how Ferrucci describes it. This is the significance of Achilles' shield. As an image of the hero's consciousness, it reflects the cosmos while representing it, and is thus the first symbolic image of art's capacity to function as a stereoscope. As a similar situation recurs in every great book, the paradox of writing is continually magnified. The first model of reality is being created. The first work contains its own interpretation. Art has already the power to formulate art. The cosmos contains the poem in which resides the shield that reflects the universe. The poem becomes an image of the cosmos, so complete as to discourage any attempt to compete with it. And this, I'm personally fascinated by the concept of a labyrinth. So there's Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentinian short story writer, writes about labyrinths in brilliant ways. But the idea that art itself is a labyrinth, there's layer upon layer, there's corridor upon corridor. And whenever I've given talks that refer to Greek mythology, it's so difficult, because if you're trying to explain to an audience who isn't familiar with Greek mythology, if you try and tell the most simple tale, so I'm going to do a whole session on Narcissus, the particularities of the myth. But the background to Narcissus is important. So his mother, Liriope, and her getting a prediction from the seer called Tiresias. And why did that happen? And on and on and on. It goes back and back and back, and the myths refer to each other. So it's like a snake eating its own tail, not just a snake eating its own tail. That's like an individual piece of art. But in the Metamorphoses by Ovid, it's tales within tales, as in Tales, and there's tales of snakes being eaten by other snakes around and around and around. There's about 250 stories in Metamorphoses. And that in itself is almost a metaphor for how myths work in general, because they're always interconnected. They're trying to replicate the cosmos and its, multiple complications. And that's what art does. And part of this channel's purpose is to show that this is the richness of classical art. Whereas in a time of TikTok, in an age of Instagram, everything's much more self-contained. Concepts of the Matrix and etc. aren't particularly original, but they help to express this circumscribed, limited experience of reality. So, In Search of Lost Time, which is a stunning, huge 6-volume novel by Marcel Proust, à la recherche de temps perdu. And I'm going to be describing a few paintings as they are described by Proust in Search of Lost Time. So there was Proust, the real writer, and the narrator of In Search of Lost Time is Marcel, and Proust was called Marcel, and it's semi-autobiographical anyway. And towards the end of the novel, which I'll explain as I come to it, Proust was worried. He had very bad health, and he was worried that he wouldn't finish. He wouldn't have time to finish his novel. So there's lots of reflections upon mortality, which also links with the concepts of artists and what they leave for posterity. So it's, and the beginning of the novel, most people only ever get, even though they might enjoy it, they rarely get past the first chapter, but it's, Marcel is a little boy, and he's like a hypersensitive little mommy's boy, because he lies there waiting for his mother to come up and give him a goodnight kiss. And the informal rule in their household is if their parents are having a dinner party, he may not get his goodnight kiss. And he starts almost hyperventilating in bed, waiting for his mother, and he describes how he does it most nights, waiting for his mother's kiss. And at the very end of the book, he remembers the chime of the trilling, the pealing of the bell in the garden. So the friend of the family, Monsieur Swan, he'll have dinner or be out in the garden having drinks with the parents, and then he knows he's leaving because Marcel knows Monsieur Swan is leaving because he can hear the peal of the bell. And at the very end of the novel, after thousands of pages, the memory of that bell comes back, and the book is consistently about memory, as we'll see in a second, with reference to the involuntary memory triggered by the Madeleine, the biscuit, the Madeleine, the half biscuit, half cake, like a Jaffa cake. Is it a biscuit? Is it a cake? We don't know. But that brings back involuntary memories, and the whole book has episodes of involuntary memories. So at the beginning, he's a small child who hears a bell. At the very end of the novel, he's an adult, getting close to death, and he hears the same bell. And the theme of the whole book is that the length of time that's elapsed, and yet psychologically, the sound of that bell as a young child can still be part of you as a person approaching death. And that, again, to repeat the introductory quote from Shakespeare, "'Tis wondrous strange." That's what I'm describing, what Proust is describing, is very true of human experience. Not in a scientific sense, because in human experience the years collapse, they telescope in. And that is indeed wondrous strange, and you should welcome it as a strange thing. And that's, I'd argue, what In Search of Lost Time is all about. Welcoming and coordinating yourself to the strangeness that is life. So these are the Madeleines I mentioned, the Petite Madeleines, and so I wanted to include the French translation at the top, just to show you the significance in the French. So she sent for one of those short, plump cakes called Petite Madeleine, which seems to have been moulded from the grooved valve of a Saint-Jacques scallop shell. And you can see the two French words with the acute E in the first one, which means it's the past participle of to mould, so it means moulded. But then you've also got mussels. The same word can mean mould or mussel. So given the image I started with, you know, the potentially 500,000-year-old mussel, I do find it coincidentally resonant that the Madeleine, the famous biscuit cake that triggers all Proust memory, or like I say, there's about 11 or 13 of these type of incidents in the whole of the novel. But I think the Madeleine, the story of the Madeleines, or the incident of the Madeleines, is what most people remember or know of the book. So there they are. Delicacy. And there's the actual scallops, Michelin style, filled with breadcrumbs and lovely French cuisine. So these are the three. The novel In Search of Lost Time is riddled in the best possible way with references to art. But these are the three I'm picking out. So there's a Vermeer, there's the View of Delft, which is like a cityscape, a townscape, as opposed to, you know, mostly famous for things like Girl with a Pearl Earring and portraits, or domestic Dutch scenes. Then there's a Rembrandt self-portrait. From memory, about 2 or 3 years before he died, so he's getting on, he's becoming a bit of an old man. And then there's the famous painting, Manet, the Déjeuner sous l'herbe. So what I'm going to do is I'll show you the View of Delft. And it's quite a long quote, so please bear with me, but I just think it's interesting. In the book, the episode where the View of Delft is discussed by Proust is there's a character in the book called Bergot, who he loves the Vermeer and he's ill. So this is the semi-autobiographical, because in real life, Proust had to make a real effort to go and see a Vermeer exhibition, and he really wasn't feeling well, but he had this overwhelming wish to go and see it. And in Proust's account of Bergot going to see it, Bergot dies, and the effort is so much, but he's so desperate to see it. So it's quite a long quote, but I think it's worth, I hope it is anyway, I think it's worth reading. So this is Bergot being described in the novel. The circumstances of his death were as follows. A fairly mild attack of uremia had led to his being ordered to rest. But an art critic, having written somewhere that in Vermeer's View of Delft, lent by the Gallery at The Hague for an exhibition of Dutch painting, a picture which he adored and imagined that he knew by heart, a little patch of yellow wall, which he could not remember, was so well painted that it was, if one looked at it by itself, like some priceless specimen of Chinese art, of a beauty that was sufficient in itself. Bergot ate a few potatoes, left the house and went to the exhibition. At the first few steps he had to climb, he was overcome by an attack of dizziness. He walked past several pictures and was struck by the aridity and pointlessness of such an artificial kind of art, which was greatly inferior to the sunshine of a windswept Venetian palazzo or of an ordinary house by the sea. At last he came to the Vermeer, which he remembered as more striking, more different from anything else he knew, but in which, thanks to the critic's article, he noticed for the first time some small figures in blue, that the sand was pink, and, finally, the precious substance of the tiny patch of yellow wall. His dizziness increased. He fixed his gaze like a child upon a yellow butterfly that it wants to catch, on the precious little patch of wall. That's how I ought to have written, he said. My last books are too dry. I ought to have gone over them with a few layers of colour, made my language precious in itself, like this little patch of yellow wall. Meanwhile, he was not unconscious of the gravity of his condition. In a celestial pair of scales, there appeared to him, weighing down on one of the pans, his own life, while the other contained the little patch of wall so beautifully painted in yellow. He felt that he had rashly sacrificed the former for the latter. All the same, he said to himself, I shouldn't like to be the headline news of this exhibition for the evening papers. He repeated to himself, little patch of yellow wall with a sloping roof, little patch of yellow wall. Meanwhile, he sank down on to a circular settee, whereupon he suddenly ceased to think that his life was in jeopardy, and reverting to his natural optimism, he told himself, it's nothing, merely a touch of indigestion from those potatoes which are undercooked. A fresh attack struck him down. He rolled from the settee to the floor, as visitors and attendants came hurrying to his assistance. He was dead. Well, this is the next one. So that was a cheery one, wasn't he? All the way to an exhibition just to die. But this is a self-portrait. I'll get out the way in a second so you can see it properly. But a self-portrait of Rembrandt, like I said, close towards, quite near towards the end of his life. And I've seen this. This is in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, from memory, in Scotland. And I've seen this one in real life, and I think it would have more effect on me now because I saw it when I was relatively young. But as I get, and none of us are getting any younger, but as I get more and more decrepit, I do remember seeing this, and the eyes just look through you across the ages, which is a theme, the idea of, going across the void of time, that's present in the Proust, but also the very last image I'll show you today. But anyway, if you have a closer look at this, this is what Proust has to say about within In Search of Lost Time, about, he refers to Vermeer and Rembrandt, but I'll just, I wanted to show you a Rembrandt because you were already seeing a Vermeer. So he says, through art alone we are able to emerge from ourselves, to know what another person sees of a universe which is not the same as our own, and of which, without art, the landscapes would remain as unknown to us as those that may exist on the moon. Thanks to art, instead of seeing one world only, our own, we see that world multiply itself, and we have at our disposal as many worlds as there are original artists, worlds more different from one another than those which revolve in infinite space, worlds which, centuries after the extinction of the fire from which their light first emanated, whether it is called Rembrandt or Vermeer, send us still, each one, its special radiance. And I think in the context of when I read the short excerpt from Hamlet, this idea, 'tis wondrous strange, the idea that we get through art to see the strangeness to us of other people's perceptions of the world. So in this painting I get a strong sense at least, of the individuality of Rembrandt. And there's almost a whole life's experience just in that gaze coming back at you. And this is the famous Manet painting, Le Déjeuner sous l'herbe. And obviously it depicts what looks like quite a fun day, as you do. You tend to take all your clothes off at the picnic or dive in the local pond. But, never to miss the opportunity to make it about mortality. This observation by Proust's narrator comes towards the end of the whole 6-volume novel. So it goes as follows. Yet it was precisely when the thought of death had become a matter of indifference to me that I was beginning once more to fear death, under another form, it's true, as a threat not to myself, but to my book, since for my book's incubation, this life that so many dangers threatened was for a while at least indispensable. Victor Hugo says, grass must grow and children must die. To me, it seems more correct to say that the cruel law of art is that people die, and we ourselves die after exhausting every form of suffering, so that over our heads may grow the grass, not of oblivion, but eternal life, the vigorous and luxuriant growth of a true work of art, and so that thither, gaily and without a thought for those who are sleeping beneath them, future generations may come to enjoy their déjeuner sous l'herbe. Now, I'll finish with, I just want to give you some background. So that was from Time Regained, the volume 6 of In Search of Lost Time. And now I'm going to read you, please forgive me, it's the last 2.5, 3 pages of the novel, the whole 6 volumes. So if you're ever planning on reading Proust, maybe you want to just switch off now and you've just wasted 40 minutes or so of your life. Sorry about that. But what I'm trying to express, I'll read out the Proust, but I'll show you a completely different image, which is also prehistoric. What I wanted to try and convey is the way in which Proust's whole novel is about, obviously, the passage of time, but reaching across the divides. So in the last quote, the idea that you got the sense of the posterity of an artist, the way in which they live on. And the quote at the end of the novel, the long quote I'm going to read to you, the context is the narrator Mussel, he's at a party of the Guermantes family. So I think there's a reference in the quote to masked people going past him. It's a masked ball type thing. And he has memories, and I've mentioned there are involuntary memories throughout the novel. But I mentioned earlier he has this memory of the pealing bell from his childhood. So that's what he's referring to. He's sat in a party full of adults, but he has these unbidden memories that just come to him of his childhood and make him think of the passage of time and his own mortality. Now, this is what I'd ask you to contemplate while I'm reading the long quote. This was also an image found in an Indonesian cave, and it's a stencil whereby Paleolithic man would blow pigment over the back of their outstretched hand to create this. Now, if I was being facetious, when I look at this, always reminds me of karaoke night singing Neil Diamond, Hand Touching Hand, Sweet Caroline. But obviously, much more seriously, the reaching out of over time that's present in all the examples I've given you, from the first mussel shell, then Homer and Achilles' shield, then Plato's discussion, now Proust, but across that whole gamut of Western art. Well, this isn't Western, but Western high art, Western literary art, Western visual art. Before all of that, you have this prehistoric, almost pre-human hand stretching out to us. So at the very end of this long quote, I think the relevance of this painting becomes hopefully more apparent. So if you can just look at this for a second, and I'll find this final quote. So this is the narrator, remember, sitting there at the party of the Gamont. And he says, this notion of time embodied, of years past but not separated from us, it was now my intention to emphasize as strongly as possible in my work. And at this very moment, in the house of the Prince de Gamont, as though to strengthen me in my resolve, the noise of my parents' footsteps as they accompanied Monsieur Swann to the door, and the peal, resilient, ferruginous, interminable, fresh and shrill, of the bell of the garden gate, which informed me that at last he had gone, and that Mamma would presently come upstairs. These sounds rang again in my ears. Yes, unmistakably, I heard these very sounds, situated though they're in a remote past. And as I cast my mind over all the events which arranged an unbroken series between the moment of my childhood, when I had first heard its sound, and the Gamont party, I was terrified to think that it was indeed the same bell which rang within me, and that nothing that I could do would alter its jangling notes. On the contrary, having forgotten the exact manner in which they faded away, and wanting to relearn this, to hear them properly again, I was obliged to block my ears to the conversations which were proceeding between the masked figures all around me. For in order to get nearer to the sound of the bell, and to hear it better, it was into my own depths that I had to descend. And this could only be because its peal had always been there, inside me. And not this sound only, but also, between that distant moment and the present one, unrolled in all its vast length, the whole of that past which I was not aware that I carried about within me. When the bell of the garden gate had pealed, I already existed, and from that moment onwards, for me still to be able to hear that peal, there must have been no break in continuity, no single second at which I had ceased or rested from existing, from thinking, from being conscious of myself, since that moment from long ago still adhered to me, and I could still find it again, could retrace my steps to it, merely by descending to a greater depth within myself. And it is because they contain thus within themselves the hours of the past that human bodies have the power to hurt so terribly those who love them. Because they contain the memories of so many joys and desires already effaced for them, but still cruel for the lover who contemplates and prolongs in the dimension of time the beloved body of which he is jealous, so jealous that he may even wish for its destruction. For after death, time withdraws from the body, and the memories so indifferent grow so pale, are effaced in her who no longer exists, as they soon will be in the lover whom for a while they continue to torment, but in whom before long they will perish, once the desire that owed its inspiration to a living body is no longer there to sustain them. Profound Albertine, whom I saw sleeping, and who was dead. In this vast dimension, which I had not known myself to possess, the date on which I had heard the noise of the garden bell at Combray, that far distant noise which nevertheless was within me, was a point from which I might start to make measurements. And I felt, as I say, a sensation of weariness and almost of terror at the thought that all this length of time had not only, without interruption, been lived, experienced, secreted by me, that it was my life, was in fact me, but also that I was compelled so long as I was alive to keep it attached to me, that it supported me, and that perched on its giddy summit, I could not myself make a movement without displacing it. A feeling of vertigo seized me as I looked down beneath me, yet within me, as though from a height which was my own height of many leagues, at the long series of the years. I understand now why it was that the Duc de Gaumont, who to my surprise, when I had seen him sitting on a chair, had seemed to me so little aged, although he had so many more years beneath him than I had presently, when he rose to his feet and tried to stand firm upon them, swayed backwards and forwards upon legs as tottery as those of some old archbishop, with nothing solid about his person but his metal crucifix, to whose support there rushes a mob of sturdy young seminarists, and had advanced with difficulty, trembling like a leaf, upon the almost unmanageable summit of his 83 years, as though men spend their lives perched upon living stilts, which never cease to grow, until sometimes they become taller than church steeples, making it in the end both difficult and perilous for them to walk, and raising them to an eminence from which they suddenly fall. And I was terrified by the thought that the stilts beneath my own feet might already have reached that height. It seemed to me that quite soon, now I might be too weak to maintain my hold upon a pass which already went down so far. So, if I were given long enough to accomplish my work, I should not fail, even if the effect were to make them resemble monsters, to describe men as occupying so considerable a place, compared with the restricted place which is reserved for them in space, a place on the contrary prolonged past measure, for simultaneously, like giants plunged into the years, they touch the distant epochs through which they have lived, between which so many days have come to range themselves in time.